Well, welcome to this half of Talking Europe and indeed to The Hague in the Netherlands. We're at the headquarters of Europol, the EU law enforcement agency, to meet with its director, Mr. Rob Wainwright. Mr. Wainwright, thanks for your time. Now, Europol, has a goal of fighting terrorism, fraud, trafficking, both drug and human, cybersecurity, a lot on your plate. And it looks like the EU in general, it seems a more dangerous place. We're seeing, attacks in France, Belgium, Germany. Is it less safe than before?
I think we're certainly facing much tougher security challenges in Europe. Over the last 5 years, I've seen at Europol how the cyber dimension has gone off the scale, really, in terms of how cyber criminals attack financial institutions, individuals, governments as well, of course. But really, the threats that we've seen in the last 2 years, from terrorism with 12 major security incidents since the start of 2015, and of course the migration crisis, which we've seen at Europol underpinned by very sophisticated criminal organizations. So yes, I suppose we're seeing the globalization of crime and terrorism, and that's bringing us bigger challenges across Europe.
Now, I know at the end of last year, Europol was saying that there's already a number of terrorist fighters from that Islamic State group, ISIS, in the EU. What kind of evidence do we have that it sounds so terrifying. What kind of evidence is there and how do you fight that?
Well, one of Europol's role is to house the European Counter-Terrorism Centre, which we launched a year ago in direct response to the elevated terrorist threat. And we've been focused especially on improving the level of intelligence sharing between national counter-terrorist agencies at the European level so that we can respond to what is clearly a European problem with thousands of foreign fighters crossing our borders, going to Syria and Iraq, many of them coming back to be involved in terrorist activity. We've made really significant progress in this area. I can tell you over the last 2 years there's been a tenfold increase in the amount of counter-terrorist intelligence shared at Europol. So we're building a much bigger picture, and from that we can see dangerous movements and patterns of foreign fighters especially.
Now, if, for example, the Islamic State group is defeated in Syria and Iraq, that could be a bad thing for the EU in some ways.
Well, I think in overall terms it's a good thing because it will squeeze the ability of that group to use Syria and Iraq as a launch pad, as a training centre, for example, to plan attacks in Europe. But I think you're right, in the short to medium term there might be a consequence by maybe seeing an increase in the amount of foreign fighters that then come back into Europe, maybe in the hundreds of them over a certain period. We'll have to deal with that. It'll be a reintegration challenge, I think, to our society, certainly a security challenge to a certain extent, but we're ready for that and we're working, I think, in the EU to prepare for that.
It does seem today that whenever any kind of form of attack takes place, it can be just one person carrying out something that after a while it's reclaimed by the Islamic State group. How much do you think it's lone wolves, it's random people carrying out attacks, or that they're actually part of this wider network?
Well, it's both, and there are many different scenarios that we're seeing, of course. And that reflects, I think, the diversity, the complexity of the terrorist threat, especially. Paris and Brussels attacks clearly showed us that ISIS are capable of mounting well-planned, large-style, network-style operations. I think that's still a threat, that they can still do that in Europe, although we've worked very hard to make it much more difficult for them. So instead, you've seen in recent communications from these terrible videos that they put out, encouraging more and more lone actors to do something almost on the spot, almost without warning. And we've seen the devastating consequences of that in Nice and, of course, at Christmas time in Berlin as well. So I think that the ability of the group to use the internet especially to radicalize the minds of disaffected people in society, to do something in a randomized way, is a major part of the threat that we're facing in Europe at the moment.
Well, since those terrorist attacks, notably in France and Belgium, Europol was in a way given more powers, was it not? And I believe the changes will come into effect in May. What exactly is changing in terms of the mandate that Europol is given? Currently today, I believe you can't make arrests in different countries, you can't go into other member states and carry out investigations.
Well, that's still not going to change, and I don't think it should. I don't think that we need a so-called European FBI. I think all of the necessary police powers are quite rightly held by the national agencies themselves. But what's really important to fighting very modern security threats that are defined by their international cross-border nature is that we use data and technology in a smart way to track the criminality and terrorism across borders. And that's what Europol has invested in over the last 10 years, becoming, I think, the principal information hub, the data hub for the fight against crime and terrorism. You know, we've connected 750 different law enforcement agencies on our data sharing platform and use that every day to identify intelligence operations, to allow the national agencies to do their work, which is to arrest these people on the ground.
Okay, so that trust really among countries growing, and that can make us safer. But also part of the changes will be this internet referral unit to combat terrorist propaganda online, including on social media like Facebook or that. I believe you're working with them. Of course, that also begs the question of how much can security forces have access to these kind of social media without impinging on privacy of people like myself?
Yes, exactly, and I think it's an area that we've got to get right. But in the space of terrorism online, I think there is common consensus amongst the public at large, with the industry as well, the tech world that we're already working with, by referring thousands of cases every year to them, where we're getting 90% approval rating. They're actually the internet service providers. They're taking the content offline, not us. But they're doing it on our recommendation in 90% of the cases. And that shows, therefore, without giving Europol any new powers, that we're able to come to an understanding and a commonality between the police on one side and the tech community on the other. And so I think we can get this right sometimes, isn't it? We're not always at war with each other. We do have a common point of view about how the internet should develop in a way that's a safe as well as a free part of our lives, and that's an important concept that we have at Europol.
And a hard line, I imagine, sometimes to define what is marked terrorist propaganda, what is free speech, and all the rest of it. There's also that question of cybersecurity in general, this encryption. A lot of law enforcement agencies are calling for these encryption backdoors, meaning law agencies would be allowed find the real information. But that brings me to question, if law enforcement agencies can have access, then surely it can never be fully secure. Yeah,
I agree with that sentiment, and this is a very tough thing to get right, actually, because we know that encryption is being used increasingly by terrorists and criminals to hide their real identity, to hide their communication, and to plan attacks and large-scale criminal operations. It's a real feature of trying to respond to these security threats. At the same time, encryption is hugely important, essential to the way in which people and of course e-commerce works and how they run their activities online. So should we never talk about banning encryption? I don't think actually we should talk about any backdoors either, because that would be deliberately engineering security vulnerabilities in our framework. But I do think we have to have a better balance, a legislative balance, which allows, in certain circumstances, police to have the same kind of rights online that they have in the everyday world. We all know that the police, under certain conditions, can monitor and track suspected terrorists if they're using telephones or if they're using international banking system. There's all well-regulated places there which allow police to do their job. We don't have anything like that on the internet, and I don't understand why that has to be the only part of our lives that doesn't have that balance and proportionality. And that's what we've got to fix. And I think legislators still have to do a bit more in this area. And I think also that the police and the law and the tech sector have to come together, perhaps in a more enterprising way.
Okay, it's quite a fascinating world. Really, when you think of moving our real world into the virtual world. One thing you have said, that for you, the internet world is nearly the biggest threat we have, more than even this Schengen zone, which was, a lot of fingers were pointed to the failure of the Schengen zone in marking security across the EU. I believe a former head of Europol said it's an open invitation to terrorists. Is it not, though, having physical borders, would that not make us more secure? Surely people could travel, wouldn't be able to travel so far so fast.
Yes, of course, border security is one way of protecting our security. But, you made the link between the internet and Schengen, and I've used that analogy before. These are two examples of instruments of our freedom that we love in Europe and indeed other parts of the world. And the benefits that are accrued by citizens every day from the internet or from freedom of movement within Europe are huge. They're hugely important. It's become a way of life. So it's not the job of police to call for those benefits to be taken away. We have to work harder in our community to protect those benefits from being abused by criminals and terrorists. So Schengen is great. Schengen should be here to stay, but we need to work even harder inside the Schengen zone through better intelligence sharing, better operational coordination to protect those benefits and to stop the criminals and terrorists from exploiting these wonderful freedoms that we have.
EU police force, really, even if they're different nationalities, forming into one in a way.
Well, no, as we've seen, I said, we've had a tenfold increase in the amount of counter-terrorist data sharing in the last 2 years. That shows that the community is now working in a more European way, common European way, to deal with what is clearly an increased terrorist threat. So I think we are responding in the right way, making use of tools like Europol to make our societies safer, but at the same time without taking away the benefits that we're trying to protect in the first place.
Now, another thing I believe you said in the past is that the refugees coming into the EU are very vulnerable, really, to being used by terrorist organisations. And of course, a lot of people feel that even terrorists can smuggle in with these people fleeing war zones. But to date, how often do you think that is actually the case, and what is being done to counteract that?
Well, it's not very often at all, and it's a very, very negligible part of the totality of the number of migrants and asylum seekers that have reached Europe. But there have been some isolated examples of terrorists seeking to use those channels as well. And because of that, Europol has responded, therefore, with the support of our member states and the EU, by deploying for the first time teams of dedicated counter-terrorist experts to the front line in Greece, even on the Greek islands, to help the border officials there to detect suspicious movements of potential terrorists. So we've strengthened our external border, therefore, with a specific counter-terrorist measure to stop that from happening, and already they've been working on a number of cases. So we are responding to that, but let's be very clear. We cannot conflate the problem of uncontrolled migration with terrorism. The two are almost exclusively different. There have been a few isolated cases which we're working to deal with.
Okay. Now, with the new changes or the powers, if you like, that are coming into Europol, we did see one EU member state decide to opt out of Europol. It was Denmark. Why? What was it so afraid of with these new changes?
Well, I think that was part of a much wider referendum in which the Danish people were asked to vote on a series of over 20 different packages, of which one was Europol, and the polling showed that actually membership of Europol is widely supported, but I think it was part of a wider referendum. Since then, I'm pleased that the Danish government and the European Commission, for example, and the European Council have looked very hard at trying to find a political solution to keep Denmark as engaged as possible from what will be their new status once our new regulation comes into effect on the 1st of May. And they found a political solution, not yet fully executed. We're helping as much as possible. I don't want any member state to leave Europol.
Surely it makes us less secure. It's going backwards in a way.
Well, I think providing we can find a modality that allows Danish police information in particular to share information with Europol, I think that's important.
That's the main thing.
I don't think they're worried about anything. I think actually, if you listen to what the Danish Prime Minister says, they see absolutely the value of being connected with what is a stronger, ever more stronger Europol in helping Denmark and other member states to fight crime and terrorism.
Of course, one country, if and when they trigger this Article 50, as we're all expecting, and they leave the EU, the United Kingdom, then they will no longer be a member of Europol. And they've been quite an active member. Will the 27 member states that are left be in a much less safe position when the UK is gone?
Well, you're right. The UK has been a really important driving force, indeed one of the leaders of Europol over many years. And there's a lot of expertise here, a lot of information here that comes from the British law enforcement community. We need to keep that clearly in the name of common European security. There are modalities for non-EU member states to cooperate very closely with Europol. We have 12 or more countries actually here today with liaison officers and with their own data being exchanged here. The United States, for example, has a very large operational community here. So I expect the UK will be in some kind of associate membership like the United States or Norway. Not quite the same as the full benefits that member states have, but in operational terms still very strong. So I'm hopeful that the outcome of the negotiation can still preserve an active role for the United Kingdom in Europol.
Okay. And now we spoke about cybersecurity and in terms of terrorism and in terms of companies and all of that, but also when it comes up to general elections across the European Union, we're seeing a lot of fears coming from Germany and indeed here in the Netherlands. I believe the government is now going to hand count the vote because they fear that hacking could be carried out even by other countries like from Russia. How much do you think that is an actual danger.
Well, I'm not really the expert to talk about that. You know, that's something that the cybersecurity institutions in the member states are dealing with. We're certainly not investigating any reported cases of that. But what I do see through the hundreds of very high-level cybercrime investigations that Europol is supporting every day is indeed the instruments in the hacking world online are growing in sophistication. They're being used by more and more, certainly cybercriminal actors, to attack many parts of our society, including especially the business world. So we're very much alive to the threat and see those instruments as they're being developed.
How do you feel about the year ahead? Are we over the worst of the attacks that we've seen in the EU?
I think we're still living in dangerous times. The threat from terrorism is still volatile. We have many foreign fighters, I think, that are still to return to Europe, and we still have this almost perennial threat of lone actors that can strike again. So I think, unfortunately, we will probably see further attacks in Europe. I think that at the same time, I can see the community working very hard and stopping most attacks. That's what I see through the work that they do. So the threat is still there. We certainly can't reduce it to zero because of the nature of that threat. But I'm still positive that we're making progress.
Mr. Wainwright, it was lovely to speak with you, and thank you indeed for your time. Thanks also to you at home. That brings us to the end of this half of Talking Europe.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
With its breathtaking scenery, the SWAT